for joining us for the third act of this event, Innovative Inos Spreading Open Knowledge and Open Innovation to Higher Education, and to this Knowledge Cafe entitled Open Data in all its form. So we have people, it's in a hybrid board, so we have people in the amphitheater of the campus Bastille of the University of Bordeaux, and some people online as well. So just a few words. The Knowledge Cafe is part of a general event called INOS for integrating open and citizen science into active learning pedagogies. You may attend the session of this morning. INOS is a European project funded by the Erasmus Plus Foundation that has developed activities, experiences, and tools to encourage university to be part of the growing movement of open and citizen science. So since the writing of the project in 2019, we were really keen to organize a Knowledge Cafe as an open event, open to general public and open to society at large. So organizing this event on the question of open data was important for us because as the title of the conference suggests, this question is above all a societal challenge which implies pedagogy and acculturation to certain updated concepts. So this pedagogical aspect was the comment we made to the data activists, a team of open data scientists with Antoine Blanchard on my right and Sylvain Lapointe on my left. They accept the challenge by including INOS use cases, but also external cases like OpenStreetMap. So thanks, Frédéric Rodrigo, as well, to be part of this Knowledge Cafe. So thanks to them, thanks to the INOS partners who are here online, and thanks to OpenStreetMap for accepting the invitation. So I leave the floor to you, Antoine.
Thank you very much, Hélène. So I've checked in Zoom that everyone hears you, and that's the case. So you can hear us and you can see us. So that's the perfect setup. So tonight we will journey along the open data cycle, and as we go along, we will discover how open data can be used in university settings, which was really at the core of INOS, and used with students and society at large. You will see that open data provides a rich material for all sorts of open innovation projects. And the first step of the open data cycle is the planification step. You start thinking about what you want to do and what kind of data you need to do it. And while you plan, you think about what is data, what constitutes data. And the first inspiring concept of the evening will be presented by Sylvain Lapointe, my colleague from Data Activist, who is a data journalist by trade. So Sylvain, over to you.
Thank you, Antoine. So the first question I'd like to ask tonight is, have you ever heard of CAPTA? Okay, so that's a rough start because we've been talking for 5 minutes about data and I'm already shifting gears. It's not about data anymore, it's about CAPTA. But okay, so let's take data. What does data mean? Data, from its roots, comes from the latent given. So something that should supposed to be given, something that is given by the subject, by the environment, by the planet as itself. But is data really a given thing? If you think about it, okay, if you think about it, is any data provided to you like an immanent fact, like something that doesn't need any work at all? Let's take the most basic data you can think of. One of the most historical data you have, census, counting people in the population. Is that provided to you very easily? Okay, let's take French census. French census is quite a mess, actually. It's taking different rhythm for big and small cities, tens of thousands of census agents that are coordinated in several tens of thousands of cities across France with different cycles of recruitment, a lot of different questions. You've got 3 levels of questionnaire, etc., etc., a rolling method to update data every year, etc. So that's pretty much the most opposite thing you can do when given. It's pretty remote from the concept of data as itself. And that's why in the 2010 work, Jensen provided another word for that. The other word being this famous capta thing. Captum is not given. Capta is caught. Something that is caught like in fishing, a fishing trip. I come from La Rochelle, so I may take talk about my sea and fishing along the evening. So if you take capta into account, and if you consider that the way that you actually plan the cache of your data determines most of the nature of the data you will cache, actually, data is not that cohesive and that relevant of a word. Then let's consider another method of census. What if it is a country that is hard to walk through? What is a country that is hard to get data from? What is a country where it is very difficult to come to all the places that you should cover to make a good census? Let's talk about Tanzania, for example. In Tanzania, for now 10 years, census has been done through cell phone data. And it's actually a pretty relevant method for this very field because the rate of cell ownership has grown ever since on a very large scale, and it now reaches in the 70 to 80%. The problem is that people are the wealthiest to have, that people with cell phones are actually wealthier than those who have no cell phone. So you don't do the same census as you do in France, because in France, people only need to have a door to knock on in order to be actually collected. So every kind of data collection, every kind of data planning actually needs to make choices. And those choices determine what you will catch. That is what capta comes into. That is why capta is a relevant notion to think about planning a data collection ahead.
Thank you very much, Sylvain, for this explanation. And we have our first design case from the INOS project with Kai. If you can hear me, Kai Pata is a professor at the School of Education at the University of Tallinn in Estonia. And she will now present how data was taken into consideration when planning for a design activity. So Kai, over to you.
Hello. I am going to tell you one example case that I did with my students from human-computer interaction and open society technologies master programs. What we do is we try to understand we with the students try to understand where the values are hidden. Values is a kind of data that are not so clearly always positioned somewhere around us, but they are. This is something that is created by the interaction of people. So what we did with our students, do you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Okay. What we did with a group of students, every group of students was choosing one case, and the case selection was based on finding a system where human interaction with the technical tools creates some collective knowledge and using the data and try to analyze such a system, how this system works and how the values are created and how to bring these values more open. So their task was, first phase was such that they analyzed the system, what kind of elements there are, what kind of processes there are. And I have chosen one Starship robots. That was one of the cases. You can see in Estonia already at the streets, you can order the food by robots that interact on their own. And the first phase was thinking what data there are, and it is difficult to think of the data too. For this purpose, we created a kind of data canvas that uses the FAIR principles. Hopefully, you will talk about this later. After that, when they knew what kind of data there are and how open these data are, we tried with a specific canvas to relate the data with the algorithms, with the processes, with the interaction, with how the value actually is created. So here you can see what we gave also to the students was a list of value cards, because it is very difficult to think of a lot of values. Usually we are thinking like fairness, openness, and some other more common values, but actually there are many more. And if you have a list, it is more easy to think whether it is there or not. And then you can see, for example, what values they found in this tool, such as safety, that they wanted that these tools were more autonomous, that they were more accurate in navigating, and that relates with the data, so that every interaction that the robot is doing in the environment, it is somewhere stored, and on the big picture, it improves the data map that you can see underneath here a bit. Then what else it can improve? For example, it can improve trust. That is not another thing that is not very visible. For example, interaction with the robots at the streets creates trust to them and increases the people's affinity that they would like to work with the robots. Here you can see my daughter helping the robot in front of my home because there was too much snow. And then, for example, interoperability, that the robots currently, you can see, they don't have any sign for seeing what kind of actions the robot wants to do. So they decided to design some additional things for the robot so that the car drivers and the passengers would be able to read the robot's intentions. You can see here that they thought that there could be some kind of lights related with the movement. And even more, you think that robots actually are kind of like a little humans. So if we test and if we get this big map of how robots can move in the city, this map is quite valid also for the little humans. So their accessibility was another value that could be created. So thank you. This is my case.
Thank you very much, Kai. I think it's a very great design case indeed, and it's nice seeing your students work on this kind of robots from Estonia. We have some time for questions. So regarding this step of planning, are there any questions? Also, perhaps tackling the CAPTA concept or this design case from Kai. So we can take questions online or questions here in Bordeaux. Are there any questions? No question? Okay, we will have short Q&As around the evening, so you can always come back later with your questions. Moving on, the second step of the open data cycle is the step where you collect data. So it's the data collection step obviously you need to gather the data that is needed for your activity. And while you do it, you have to be careful about the survivor bias, right, Simon?
Yes, so second question of the night, have you ever heard of survivor bias? Well, I'll ask another question. Have you ever been told this story of someone's grandma who smoked like a chimney until her 80s and ended up in a really, really good health until she died? Well, that's a very good story, and a lot of people take this story into account in order to explain to you that they'll smoke until their 80s and they're fine. Well, the problem is that this grandma actually made it to her 80s to tell the story. Because when you get the data for the people who did it until their 80s and those who didn't, the story is actually a little different. So that's an actual study about the abstention from smoking and the fact that, spoiler alert, it actually can kill you pretty earlier than you should have died. And it wasn't made upon the storytelling of many old ladies and many old men, but on a large cohort of people in Denmark taken from the crib to the grave over tens and tens of years. So that's what we call a cohort, and that's the interesting thing. You take them actually from the start to the end, whatever the end is. And that takes away what we call the survival bias, meaning, to get back to my fishing metaphor of earlier, now that you have something to catch your fish, there's another question left, being, how many fish is there left in the sea? And that's a very relevant question, not only in our ocean, but across the ocean in general. So that's the survival bias. You only can study what's left to study in your element. The problem is that most of the time, you only take account of what's left to catch. For example, okay, where is my stuff? Okay, so that's the most classical example of survival bias. During World War II, there was this study trying to find out what's the best place to reinforce the shell of the American planes and British planes. And what they had left to study weren't actually the planes that went down, of course, because they went down in the middle of the sea or anywhere. It was the planes that made it back. And so what happened is that a lot of people said, well, look at all those holes in this part and this part and this part of the plane. Let's make it thicker where the holes are. And there's actually a very born mathematician who said, well, let's consider that we only see the plane who could make it back. So those holes are actually the kind of holes you can make it back with. So we should instead pretty much do the opposite and put extra reinforcements where there actually are no holes, because if those parts are touched, you can see the plane back. And actually, if you look, it's pretty strange that those planes that make it back actually don't have a single hole in the part where you got the pilot or where you got the motors. Pretty weird, right? But that's the most obvious one, but you can have many, many examples of that. Simple one. You take the result of the French presidential election and you say, well, 58.55% of French voted for Emmanuel Macron on the second term. But if you only take account of registered voters, it goes down to 38.5. If you go down to people that actually showed up, that's another term. If you go down to people that could have been voters and could have registered, that's 10 to 15% more people that weren't accounted for. That's survival bias. Survival bias tells you that if you study companies from company registers, as many are in open data now, you only can study the companies that are left. If you study the birds in the field, you only can find the birds that actually stood in the field, not the one that went away, etc., etc. Survivorship bias, or survival bias, gives you a very good lesson that you should take into account what you can say with data, but you should also always think when collecting what you can't say about data.
Thank you, Sylvain. I'm now calling Julieta Barrenechea to present a design case from INOS. So Julieta is in charge of Ocean I3 project at the Innovation Department at the University of Bordeaux and also at the Urge Campus Foundation. She will show how data collection was paramount to this very exciting project, also talking about sea, Sylvain.
Thank you very much. So Ocean I3 is a challenge-based learning project. It's a project that involves two universities, the University of the Basque Country and the University of Bordeaux. And they developed this project in the frame of an strategic alliance. So it's important to know the context. In Ocean I3, we form teams with students that comes from different disciplines to work together on challenges proposed by local stakeholders. But in addition to this challenge, In addition to these challenge-oriented projects, we do also some citizen science and awareness-raising activities, both for students that participate in the project and also for other publics. So I would like to present to you two activities we did, and we developed focusing on the collection and classification of plastics on the beach in the cross-border coastline. These two activities I will talk about are different in terms of the configuration of actors involved, in terms of the objectives of the collect of plastics, and also about the tools we use, and also about the final use of the data we collect. The data or the data, I don't know. So the first experience was carried out in February 2018 in collaboration with the NGO Libera, who proposed us to implement a protocol for the collection and classification of plastics based on a mobile application. It was Marnova, and it was a platform developed by the association Vertido Zero, is zero waste. And with the support, public support from the Spanish Ministry of the Ecological Transition. So this application, Marnova, is free to download, and it allows to collect, store, and display in a sample way information on marine litter, like and classify them in terms of objects we find, quantities, different categories, and it's interesting about the visibility of the data. It has a web viewer where you can see the research not only on your collect, but also about the whole collects we did with this platform. So it's international also. And in terms of outputs, every year from Marnova, from this platform, they send a report of research for the National Monitoring Program for Marine Litter on beaches in Spain. So it contributes to a public monitoring. Our activity was to go with our students, the students that participate in Ocean I3, at the first moment we did a talk about the plastic problem in beaches and preparation about the subject, and then we did a practical activity with this system. just to find plastics and to collect and classify. But the problem was that when we arrived at the beach had just been cleaned, so we could not find any plastic waste. But it's not true. It's a beach where you can find, but not at this moment. So it's also interesting about the problematic we are talking about. This protocol is not about microplastic, because I say that because if not, probably we will find it. So anyway, it was interesting because the students know the platform, they apply it, and they contribute also for this platform, knowing that and trying to then use it. So the second experience take place in September 2021. And in this case, the project collaborated with the EPOC laboratory from the University of Bordeaux, and also an association for Fish Shore and Seas Association. From the laboratory EPOC, there is a particular project that calls Art Plastic that aims to involve citizens in the collection and classification of microplastics. And this is for scientific studies and purpose. So this time the activity was to follow this scientific protocol that a PhD student from EPOC is calibrating and adjusting. And it was interesting also because it wasn't just one activity, but we were training a group of students to be multipliers with other publics then. So we did this activity to apply the protocol, to prepare this group, and then this group will be ready to do this activity in a larger activity with scholars. So the problem in this time was that the second activity with scholars, the larger one, couldn't take place because of the COVID, but the third one, this preparation and this training for students was pretty nice, and they arrived they collect, they classify, and they did some samples that were very useful for the laboratory. So that's our two experiences.
Thank you very much, Julieta. We'll take questions now. Sylvain, we already have a question in for you regarding citizen science projects and the fact that you've mentioned some data that is very difficult to get, which can be in a way hidden or undocumented. How is that a problem for citizen science projects, and also perhaps how can citizen projects help with this data that is very difficult to get or almost non-existent?
Well, thank you for this question. It's very interesting to get to citizen data, because one of the interests of crowdsourcing and in citizen data especially is that regarding your project, it's pretty relevant because it allows to cover time span and geographical span that actually can uncover some hidden or hard to get data. And so to me, citizen science can actually give an opportunity to overcome survivor bias regarding those kind of constraints. Because when you are on the clock, because you have a team, because you have to move, etc., actually training people on the ground and sharing knowledge about data collection, about the methods of compiling data and transmitting them, etc., actually provides the framework to gather data that you can't maybe stay long enough or go wide enough to gather. For the beaches, for example, it's very interesting what you talking about. There's an NGO in France called Surfrider.
They participate.
They participate also,
Yes.
okay. I didn't know they were part of it, but they actually use citizen science And as they are also backed by a lot of the surf and nautic sport community, they actually cover such a wide range of beaches and coasts on the west of France. They can cover a space that can be covered by anyone, and so they can send people all over the place. The Ligue de Protection des Oiseaux, that is a member of Birds International, BirdLife. I'm not sure. That may be another. And they actually track and map parts of the territory where there can be a need to gather data, and they can send people locally, knowing the place, knowing etc., with a specific protocol. So that's actually a way to overcome as much as you can the survival bias.
Thank you very much. And also later on, we'll have a short presentation about OpenStreetMap, which I think also does a lot of work in terms of putting together data, which is very hard to get, including data about the underground. Are there any other questions, perhaps in Bordeaux? Yes.
It's about citizen collect data. My thoughts were, you said it was a good way to collect data that cannot be collected, but in your example for birds or for plastic waste and beaches, the people that are willing to collect this data, is there maybe it's also a bias for the collect because they are do you understand me?
Yeah.
Who wants to give an answer?
I think I get your point, and actually it's totally relevant. You're right. You don't ask anyone to gather data about macroplastic on French beaches or Spanish beaches. You don't ask anyone to go and find if Ichthyodon or the kind of littoral coastal birds actually nest or not here or there. And that's where it's not only citizen project, it's citizen science. So you leverage this goodwill, but you have also to train people. And that's, to me, that's the difference between those two things. When I was mentioning the Ligue de Protection des Oiseaux, so that's part of BirdLife, I think it's BirdLife International, so you're right, I guess. It's actually an effort that is coordinated by the NGO and by the CNRS, because it also feeds into databases for biodiversity. So, of course, you rely on those people's goodwill and their urge to actually help document biodiversity and disappearance or growth of some population of birds. But actually, you have the choice between this energy that is a little biased, but that you can train, and the only energy of your lab that is very, very scarce, if I may, most of the time. And so that's a balance you have to make, and I think that you can actually make the balance, and as OpenStreetMap does, or other comments we mentioned later, by training people and putting up guidelines and sharing knowledge and actually building on this goodwill.
Thank you very much. So we now have masses of data coming in all shapes and sizes, and you have to process the data. This means your data is probably a bit messy, you have to clean it, you have to structure it, you have to check for consistency and quality. And this brings us to the major concept of data wrangling, Sylvain.
Yes, so have you heard about data wrangling? So for those of you who aren't familiar with data processing, data analysis in general, data wrangling is, well, not a very common word. I can't say data cleaning, that's only part of it. I'll take an example. Let's say you are interested in epidemiology and you just want to, well, just check what's the state of the spread of tuberculosis in a specific country. Well, lucky you, the WHO actually has tons and tons of data on tuberculosis. So that should be as easy as going on the who.ent and looking for those data about tuberculosis and then do the math and stuff. That should be that easy, right? And you end up with that. That is the actual up-to-date 2020 reference list of variables that are used to describe datasets on tuberculosis. So you have the, of course, highly popular new rel underscore HIVPOS underscore 014, one of my personal favorites. The smear underscore EQA underscore PASS, of course, and the a little controversial TBHIV underscore 014 underscore FIG. So that looks like a mess for you, only for you, because for those who gather the data and put it out, that's as clear as the day. For a very simple reason. Data is a very time, tools, and thought-intensive process. It takes a damn lot of work to collect data. So when you actually get your budget for that, your time for that, and your window of operation to go and collect this very data you've been asking for years, you won't think about all the people that may one day or another come up with this data, look for it, and try to use it for a different reason than the one you are collecting it in the first place. So what you do is actually you collect the data and you put it in the format that is the closest to the very format you need to make your analysis and no one else's. You get rid of all the variables you don't need. You put the name of the variables you actually are familiar with. And you arrange it, you make the columns, the lines, the observation, the variables you are familiar with. Don't care about all those people who actually will end up downloading your dataset in days, months, or years to do something else. So when you actually end up with those data that were produced for another purpose, the one you are actually getting to them, you spend a lot of time wrangling. So wrangling can mean all sorts of things. It can mean cleaning, so getting rid of what's irrelevant, or putting things right that are a little messy, like badly labeled variables or badly named places and stuff. It can also mean rearranging, turning some observation to variables, variables into observation, grouping stuff with one another, refactoring categories, etc., etc. It can also mean completing data. If you have, for example, some very unspecific places, you can take another database to get the geographic coordinates to put them on a map. You can update some numbers, some dates, some references, etc., etc. But in the end, all this hard work, all this deep work actually requires you to go deeper in the understanding of the data. Data wrangling, of course, is cleaning, it's rearranging, and it's transforming or completing, but it's mostly understanding. Because when you want to clean and wrangle data, you need metadata. You need data that tells you what the data is about. You need to dig deeper and deeper. And in those metadata, you have actually the real meaning of the data. And in metadata lies the depth of data set. That's unfortunate. Because behind those strange names, you actually realize, digging into those WHO data sets about tuberculosis, that the cross-infection between tuberculosis and HIV actually stands for very specific problems in epidemiology that need to be studied. Why do you take them out? Why would you take them out of the equation? You actually realize that the segmentation of the age matches some very specific kind of tuberculosis symptoms. So that's important to understand. Should you group those data with one another, or would it actually make no sense, epidemiologically speaking? And by digging in and doing this hard work, you actually are better at understanding the data and moving it around. So data wrangling is actually data understanding.
Thank you for the clear demonstration, Sylvain. And we now have a design case presented by Amalia de Godson, who is an associate professor in service design at Aalborg University in Copenhagen, Denmark. And Amalia will now present how students dealt with data processing.
Yes.
Yeah, yes.
I can see the slide now. Yes, thanks, Sylvain and Antoine. And this is a case that comes exactly from our master, which is a master in service systems design at Aalborg University. So we are working with designers. So and designers, you might know, they are very used to work with qualitative data, so field research, interviews, focus groups, and all that. This is all data that are very comfortable to work with, a little bit less when it is about more quantitative data and the kind of data sets that Sylvain just showed to all of us. So we do every year within the data workshop, we work with them for 1 week, trying to make them aware of and use actually digital tools to work with data. Depending on the brief that they have to work with, they will have also to go through, the processes, the steps of the process that have been already mentioned until now. So planning the data collection, actually collecting it, and then this data wrangling step, which is, as I guess you can imagine from what has been said at this point, it's exactly understanding data, and understanding is also challenging. So it's also the most, I would say, frustrating step in the process for what concerns the students' process. So they have to, in this slide here, you can see a representation of data visualization of what they collected. The topic was about mobility in a specific area in Copenhagen. And the students themselves decided on the data collection. So they were working with Twitter data, they were working with Instagram data, and also with open data sets. And as you can see here, this is a process of one specific group of students that were working together. So the process is, of course, goes into several steps as well. So trying to look into a specific data set, and then finding some specific insights, then moving to another one and collecting some other data sets and see if their analysis and could be complemented somehow by available data, open data sets as well. And as you can see here, it's a lot about, a process that is diverging and converging, trying to find small insights that could be used actually in the design process. What the students do here, so they use tools to collect the data, and then, of course, when they see the data sets itself, they will see that, for instance, as mentioned before, metadata is missing, so it's difficult to understand what the data is about. Or they see that specific, attributes are actually missing. So they have to go through the cleaning and reconsidering the, usefulness of the data sets itself. So they have expectation that often, are not fulfilled, and then they have to move into some other explorations. So it's after looking also into different data sets that they collect themselves as well, or scrape themselves as well, they might go through another step, which is about combining, for instance, also data sets, different data sets that complement each other. So it's, and I would say that this step here is really at the core, as it has been said, of also our data workshop, which is a 5-day workshops, and it's the step that takes lots of time. I would say that also probably being designers, this step is also a lot, there are lots of iteration here. And very often the students, jump into data visualization with what they have, to go back then to cleaning, and working with the attributes of the data sets and see what it is relevant, what is not. So it's a very, iterative and not so also clean process as it is portrayed here in this specific slide. But it is also where, most of the learning also happens during the workshop itself. And I guess that's it for the case.
Thank you very much, Amalia. We'll now take a few questions, if there are some. Yes, in Bordeaux. I don't see questions from Zoom at the moment.
Yes, I have questions. When I listen to you about wrangling problem, I have the feeling that you have a lot of problem when you don't plan correctly at the beginning of the journey. It means that if you have a lack of planning at the beginning, or if you use a set of data that was not planned for a specific study at the beginning, of course, you will have a lot of problems and you will spend a lot of time. But if you plan correctly the data that you want, the level of aggregation that you want from the beginning, you should have less problem, no?
Well, so I would say that in our case, for instance, it's again, you have to think about the context. So we are talking about designers here. So we are not talking about the data scientists or people that are, very skilled in working with data. So the control that we have, and I can put myself in the group about, for instance, the tools to collect data, or to also plan the data collection, are very limited. And very often, actually, what we do, so we enter in the process, let's say, or and I'm talking about, let me start again. We use data that is already available, it's out there, right? Or we use tools to collect data that we didn't design, right? So for instance, here it's about scraping Twitter data, but we have absolutely no control on the software that is used to scrape the data. So the data sets that we then collect afterwards, it's a little miracle we have to make sense of, right? And that's the same with open data. So we do not plan the collection very often. So we are not in the process, for the sake of this workshop in particular, we are not the designers, so the ones that planned the data collection. We are the ones that are looking online for the available data sets and go through this exploratory, very exploratory process, which is, yeah. So I would say that in this context, there is something that cannot really be planned from our side, right? And data wrangling is absolutely not evitable, from my experience, at least. I don't know if Sylvain has, and Antoine, you have something else to add.
I concur 100%. And thank you, by the way, thank you for example that is illustrating this part very, very accurately, very concretely. I just had two things. Of course, if you, as was said just earlier, if you actually use your own data and your own data only, it's great and you can plan a lot of things. But two things. First, you, as was said in the presentation before, it's an iterative process. So you all the time go back to the scope of what you planned and look at the data that actually is available to know, okay, what can I study actually? And if you say, okay, the data is not available, so let's stop the research. It's hard to go this way because as thoroughly as you plan, you can't always assume what's actually will present. Second thing is, I will just advise you to look at this excellent summary, and even if it's very clean regarding the experiments, if you look at the right side of every step is concluding lack of local data, manually coding the posts and pictures, concluding lack of open data. So a lot of time you actually end up whether concluding in a lack of data or with the manual coding actually filling in the gaps. So even with the best planning you can have, reality actually resists a great deal always.
One last question from Bordeaux.
Yes, some ethical problems behind the data analysis and the situation when data ranking is not possible. So I will explain that. For example, we have some data sets that have been so some companies or some institutions have collected data, but they have also interest behind that. So, for example, they will not show all their data for some stuff, etc. And so now the problem is that you can use some mathematics or things like that to clean the data that are there. The problem is that all your data set is biased because the people that get that and then that open for people to see it have interest. So you can think about companies' data, banks' data in the financial world, etc. But also, for example, in my field, in science, I'm working in biology, and after some articles, they are very rare. You have the raw data, but you have only the data that the lab used to publish the article, etc. So for a lot of data sets, you have some interest that can bias all the data. And so my question is a bit ironical, and maybe cynical also, but can we trust data sets when you know that you have interest behind this open data?
So that's a very, very important question you raised here. I'll just answer, as Antoine mentioned, I'm a data journalist by training and by vocation. And becoming a data journalist, I consider that data sets are like people you interview. You always have to take into account why they tell you what they tell you. Sorry. You always have to take into account why they tell you what they tell you, why they tell you. And the thing is that what you're describing here is very, very relevant and common. It's not about data wrangling at this level. It's about actually how can you infer what's missing and how can you take into account what's left. So to me, if I may, that's more of a survival bias problem than a data wrangling problem, because data wrangling is one step too far and too late to consider those biases.
And because you've mentioned data sets that are attached to scientific publications, you know the problem of negative results that cannot be published, or not as much as positive results are published. And so there's a lot of data that is actually obtained, analyzed, but not shared because it's actually supposed to show nothing, no effect. And this is data that could be somehow relevant and that is missing from the literature, indeed. So thank you very much. We're moving on now. The data is ready to answer your questions, and you can start analyzing it. Talking of which, we've slightly, Lucas mentioned aggregation of data, and Sylvain will tell us more about data granularity.
So granularity is not a word that is widely used in the public, but it's very, very commonly used in many, many fields in data science. Because granularity is actually one of the main questions you have to answer when you do an analysis. At what scale do you choose and where do you stop? This is a map of the presidential election. It takes into account some level of data. Here you have every circle matching a specific city. The color is proportional to the share of votes that were granted to one of the other candidates. A map fully painted in orange of France would actually have been another way to analyze those very same data. But here you take into account the position of the actual places and eventually the density of population. That's one way to do so. I could have showed you 100,000 other maps. The thing is that with granularity, you ask yourself, what should I take into account? Should we go from France to regions, to departments, to a community, and etc., etc. A good example of that is a map actually drawn by Data Wrapper. That's about fertility in Europe. Whether you take the NUTS 1 level, meaning the nationwide level, or the city level, you have two totally different maps, telling two totally different stories. On the top, you realize that Luxembourg is actually a very fertile country. And you think, well, France is doing okay, and Ireland too. And Germany, on the whole, is, well, on a low trend, but okay. When you zoom in a way, when you go to the finer grain, and that's the meaning of granularity, like in photography, you realize that actually it's not the country. It's people in places having babies or not. And some countries that seem very homogeneous, like Germany, actually have a big gap between rural and urban areas. Sorry, between rural areas and Berlin, actually. And you could go further and further and further into details. How far can you go? Well, you could go like in the Borges novel, where some map maker society actually tries to make a map of a 1:1 scale, meaning that the map actually covers the whole kingdom of the map makers, making no sense, being unreasonable and making it unreadable as itself. So when you do an analysis, it's always choosing actually at what scale do you put your eye and where do you stop, not only from the bigger to the smaller, but also into categories. And I'll end this demonstration with a very specific case. 1 out of 6 French people doesn't use the internet. More than 1 user out of 3 lacks basic digital skills, god damn! Some friends of mine, some journalist friends of mine on Facebook shared like, okay, now I understand why my papers don't work online. Well, just a minute. That's on scale 1, that's on the whole country, that's on the whole population. But if you go just one step under, if you go one category lower, you realize that under 50 years old, actually, you're under 10% of people not having those digital skills. And it explodes for people in their 50s, 60s, 70s, and even higher. When you go for highly educated people, those skills are pretty widespread. When you go for lower education, people actually lack those very skills. The same goes for employment status and the region they live in. So actually, if you don't go deep enough, you can make bad assumptions. But how deep will you go? That's the question to ask when making analysis.
Thank you, Sylvain. Do we have any question about granularity and data analysis? One from Yves.
No, I have many questions because sometimes when we talk about granularity, we talk about also level of decision or level of hierarchy, and this is completely related. What we want to see because what we want to decide at the end. And we know that when we aggregate data, we lose information very often. And of course, at the end, there are a lot of questions, but I completely agree with you that if we aggregate too much, we lose too much information to make decisions. But if we do not aggregate enough, we cannot make the decision because we have too much information. And we have not the right level of vision of the system that we want to control. And by this way, aggregation is something which is very useful at the end.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The next step of the open data cycle is sharing data, because open data, as opposed to closed data, means sharing your data with the crowd, and if possible, under an open license for everyone to reuse and to modify. Shared data can even contribute to what is called a commons. And Sylvain, can you tell us about commons?
Thank you. So, before talking to you about commons, I have just a very simple question related to data sharing or not data sharing. Who among you is using Waze? Okay. So, you actually have a relationship to data governance. Well, you're losing in this relationship, but you have one. Because what does Waze do with your data? With whom? Under what rules? Under what agreements? You actually signed some contracts with Waze, just by clicking, of course, but that's still a contract. And that's valid regarding most of the places you can move and most of the things you can do with Waze. And that's why this is actually a way to get back into the political side of sharing data or not sharing data. You're sharing data with Waze, and so you're kind of the subject of the data. The data is actually gathered by Waze. So Waze is collecting the data, and Waze is holding the data and sharing the data under its own terms. So if you're not invited to the table, how could you know? How could you choose to not share the data or share it under some specific terms for specific use, etc., etc.? That's where commons come into play. Commons is a notion that was made mostly popular by Elina Ostrom, who was received the prize from the National Bank of Sweden in the honor of Alfred Nobel. And she actually considered that it's not only deciding who owns something. Commons is knowing who is actually deciding and the political relationship between people around some object. This object can be anything. In our book, in the Commons, actually thinks about very common stuff, like the hallway in front of your garage and how do people deal with it, and the public space in their own street. Does the street belong to everyone? Yes, but to no one in the same place. But what defines the relationship between the people owning this place and the way it's managed? That's a political relationship. That's a way to make commons. Commons is not only this commercial or non-commercial way of thinking of things. That's also a way to consider that every governance system is also a way to make people take part into what they own in common. In the digital world, that extends to making some things available under no constraints but the ones that are set by the people who actually make those data available. And one of the greatest examples of this, and you talk further about this, is OpenStreetMap. OpenStreetMap, Open Food Facts, Wikipedia actually exists without the barriers of commercial profits, under the only rule that was given, forged, determined, and improved by those actually contributing to it. So if making data about what you know and into your own terms ends up being a production to the benefit of anyone wanting to participate, you're actually making commons. Making commons is not just sharing data, is actually putting politics back into data to some sort of common good.
Thank you, Sylvain. Exactly, so I'm now happy to introduce Frédéric Rodrigo. Frédéric is an OpenStreetMap contributor since 2008. He's also a member of the OpenStreetMap France board and is a specialist in geographic information systems at Territorio. And Frédéric will show the depth and the completeness of information from OpenStreetMap. What is actually in OpenStreetMap?
First, OpenStreetMap is a command. I'm sorry, right. It's a command built by a community. A community is people contributing to the commands to OpenStreetMap. OpenStreetMap can be seen as a wiki, like Wikidata, but a wiki about maps. People are contributing to maps and can edit map, can reuse map, but everybody can edit the map. The common are built around the community, building data and making available to everybody under licenses. In this community, there is a lot of individual people, like you can think about Wikipedia and contributor in Wikipedia, but in OpenStreetMap, there is also a company contributing, making this command. And in fact, in the web, there is Google Maps, and if you not see a Google Map, it's probably an OpenStreetMap. And an OpenStreetMap made by a community, and community of individuals, and community of company. And company contributing in OpenStreetMap, you can find Facebook, Snapchat, or other big, really big company. Why this was built? Because the lack of data, because they're missing access to the data, and perhaps you can only access map, printed map, internet map, but not the data in the map, and you cannot use it to make your own usages, your own study. And the data is made in the way of unplanned. It's the opposite what said before, but OpenStreetMap is a community, and everybody in the community has their own goal, and so the global make it really different, and everybody and every group of people and every company has its own goal. Some has the street, like in the OpenStreetMap, it's first built on the street, and it's a main thing you can see in OpenStreetMap, but there is a lot of other data. As you can see on the picture take here on just the opposite side of the block. You can map on OpenStreetMap the street, the street, and here in the picture you can see some of keywords. We call it tags. It's built on key and value. Here for street it's A grade. A grade is all kind of street, motorway, path, everything. And there is this K value residential here because we are in the city. The streets are residential. Residential is some kind of street. But we can also map building. Here is a building with building. Yes, it's a general kind of building. We don't know what kind of building it is, but it can be apartment. It can be a church. It's not the usage of the building, but the kind of the building. And here in the floor, there is another part. There is a land use construction. Land use. Here is a construction, but it can be a retail, industrial, even residential for the common part of the city. And on the right, you can see a bus stop. I agree because it's linked to all the part of the street and all common way to move and bus stop. But here it's just some first step in the mapping on the object. You can add details. For example, the building have a name. The name of the building here is writing directly on the building, and you can collect it to contribute it to OpenStreetMap. But for example, on the street, there is a name. The street has a name. The street has the must peak because you can see a profile sign, and you can add more tag, more attributes to the object. You can see a concrete stop, a concrete block stop near to the bus stop. You can see the street is a one-way, and so on. And so you can add more attributes to the data. But if you are interested on other subjects, you can also go map other kind of object. For example, a tree or a lamp to light the street, and you can see a charging station for car. You can park on the curb, and it's not free or it's free, and so on. And you can add more and more description on the kind of object you are interested on. And I pick real object from OpenStreetMap, here a tree and a bus stop, and I report it all the attributes are present on this object. And you can see on the OpenStreetMap, on the tree, you are totally not on the street object. But there is all this data for each tree in row on the street. There is a lot of data on bus stop and so on. So the data has gathered all together in an unplanned way to make many usages of the same data. So we have a big open data set as OpenStreetMap with many goals in it, with many users, with many contributors, and with many BA too, because each contributor, each group of contributors make his own way of mapping, and so there is BA on location, BA on intention, and so with all this data, we can, all this data is collected all around the world by many contributors, and today is a really usable data set and user data set. As you can see here, there is on the right part on the left, right, there is some kind of data, and on the other part, there is different representation of the same data. The same data with different map style. It's not just one data, one map, but data used for different usage. For example, a general map or a bicycle map. And here's the same data used for computing routing. The same data can be used for search engine, can be used for unplanned usage, because the data are collected generally and not focused on some goal, and there is many usage, and all together people making this possible. So the data can be indoor, we can compute routing for web share indoor, for example, or data are collected in a humanitarian crisis after a disaster for help people on the ground to focus to use still in place road and so on. So many usage from unplanned data.
Thank you very. I find it very rich, and you've shown that it's much more than a Wikipedia of maps, actually. Are there any questions about data sharing here in the room or in Zoom? Yes, one question in Zoom. From the company's point of view, isn't public financial support essential for the shared data to exist? I mean, as a business, what's the point of sharing data if you can't get return on investment? So perhaps from the point of view of OpenStreetMap, where you have contributions from companies, so what are the companies trying to get from that? What is the return on investment?
In the field of mapping, on the web, you have Google and you have the other. So all the other making a common to be a competitor of Google. And they fund it in this way. They don't have to pay Google, that's the main competitor in the field, and find another way to have map without paying competitor.
And in other domains than maps, Sylvain, do the companies need incentives to open their data sets? Or do you know examples or what are the why a company would open their data?
Well, just to give quick examples, a lot of companies actually open data in order to make their own service available and known to the general public. So, for example, a lot of data regarding transportation actually comes from transport companies, and they publish it not only for the sake of their own tool, but also to make it available. You said for Google Maps, of course, but a lot of other routing systems and apps. And actually, if you give away your data on the timetables, etc., for your own transportation systems, or for the delay, or for the price of the tickets, you actually make it easier to use, easier to purchase tickets, and to plan your routes. So actually, it's a way, giving away data is actually a way to making your services more available and easy to access.
So that's especially in the case where data isn't your core business. So sometimes data is produced as part of your business, but you can use the data to do something that will actually improve your core business. Yeah, and it doesn't decrease your value when you share the data. Thank you. We have another comment within a different project. We are in contact with the OpenStreetMap community in Denmark. I know that one of their interests is to map also what is under the streets, pipelines, water, gas pipelines. They have big troubles in getting the data from the cities. Do you have any experience with that? Problems with the utilities and pipelines?
Some kind of data may be dangerous if people know it. But in the fact, we find that the object of the data are on the ground. So we see pipeline and we can map pipeline. If the data are not open, people from open data and OpenStreetMap map it anyway.
Yes, and a few days ago there was a big disruption in internet access and in France because overnight people actually cut some of these cables. So it makes the case indeed of what is the risk of sharing the data, but sometimes the data is actually public, it's just buried in documents, it's just buried, and having the data shared and correctly structured and mapped actually will help the professionals working on these utilities on the pipeline. And so you can have, you can make a good case where actually sharing the data is better even for people who actually own the data. So thank you very much. Thank you, Frederic. The last step of the open data cycle, and our cycle is now complete, is when the data is reused by someone else, which increases its value. And talking of which, Sylvain, can you tell us about data humanism?
So this part is a little aside from the rest of the presentation because data humanism is actually an emerging notion that was crafted by design information specialists. I'll talk about later. But there's a paradox in open data. That is, lots of people have a very positivist view of sharing data, making the point that the more data you share, the more diverse the analysis, the more widespread and deep and exhaustive the analysis would be. So the more data, the more diverse the treatment and the reuses would be. The thing is that actually science and studies don't conclude the same thing. This is extracted from a paper about invasion arrows. Invasion arrows is a term that was coined by two researchers of political geography to describe the way that a lot of maps from very various origins actually depict migration, especially in Europe. And what you see on the top is a map from the Frontex program that is actually in charge of managing migration to Europe from its border. And what you have on the bottom is actually a poster for the Brexit Leave Party that depicts the immigration of people from Turkey and the Middle East to Europe. And you see that in both representation, migration is actually represented as this big threatening arrow, this invasion arrow that the author of this paper described as a very common treatment and representation of migration since, and I'm sorry for the reference, the 1940s. So actually Frontex, this agency, is using the same semiology to use this very data as some people actually developing a racist view on migration and a threatening view on migration. Is there other ways to represent it? Of course. The problem is that we don't use them. A lot of representation we actually use were coined and created by Charles-Joseph Minard or John Snow in the 1860s. And in the end, what we end up with is actually a treatment of data and a reuse of data that is very standardized, with the same kind of graphs, with the same kind of units, with the same kind of dashboards, where data is reduced as a mere indicator, where people are massified and considered as huge movements, and where the aggregation hides every bit of complexity that you can find in the data, every depth the analysis actually raised inside it. And that's where data humanism comes from. Data humanism is a term coined by design ethnographic Giorgia Lupi, Italian-born design information based in New York, and she stands to go against a lot of the notions that are pre-thought about data reuse. Against big data, she asks for small data, but data bandwidth she asked for data quality, imperfect data, subjective data, inspiring, serendipitous, data possibilities, data complexity, data drawing, data-driven design or design-driven data, etc., etc. Data about people and data made more human. Made more human with its depth and its inconsistencies. Made more human by its scale and specificities. Made more human by beauty and emotion. And as I started with a very harsh and dark note, I'll end up with a very beautiful project made by Giorgia Lupi, and shedding some light on very dark times. She actually worked with the Memory Society for Italian Jewish Community about the first census for Jewish people made by the fascist regime of Mussolini. And this actually was only summed up as a mass of people to take a part in society, to be kept out of social positions, to be deprived of their civil rights, possession, etc., etc., or even sent to death. And what she did is actually taking back all those data and making of every single one of those people a small graph, summing up everything the person was, giving them a name back, giving them their story, the complexity in the data, and stressing the point that every single person in this census actually existed in a wrong way, whatever the way they would have been summed up by this dark and horrible census. So she brought back to meaning and depth and humanity all those single points that the fascist regime tried to gather as mere mass. That's a way to do some depth with data. That's one form of data humanism.
And let's now hear from Katerina Zohu about a case of, well, she'll explain. Katerina is an expert in digital learning, and she's the CEO of Web2Learn in Greece. And her data reuse here is at the heart of a new important project that she's involved with. Over to you, Katerina.
Hello, Sylvain has placed the level too high, and I hope to be able to commit at least to this beautiful discussion about data humanism that I explore as a term. Hello, it's Katerina Zourou. I'm in Greece and head of Web2Learn, and this short presentation is about reuse of space data. And we are still in the humanities field. So space data used in a, I would say, original way in the current crisis. And it is an initiative that starts from the European Union Agency for the Space Program. And in June, there will be a series of events about crowdsourcing space data for several purposes. And the challenge that we decided to come up with is about cultural heritage under threat. Next slide, please. So the data sources are freely accessible Earth observations and space data from Galileo and Copernicus. And our choice was to use them because these data are openly accessible, and our choice was to use them for cultural heritage protection, not necessarily in the sense of protecting, because you cannot have access to the protection in a war situation, but at least document and offer also digital tools for protection and data aggregation. So the point is, use Earth observation and space data to monitor deteriorations, demolishment, and explosions that may happen together by citizens, and by using also artificial intelligence simulations for their restoration. And last slide, please. So the cooking space will be the Copernicus Open Access Hub set up by the European Space Agency, and the location where data will be collected and then analyzed from a cultural heritage perspective will be the Copernicus Online Data Access Point. This project that I just described will start next month, where other challenges related to other fields as crisis response will start. So to respond to the topic about reuse, that was the case about reuse of freely accessible EU space data and Earth observation for cultural heritage. That's it, and thank you for the invitation again.
Thank you very much, Katarina. This is a very important project, obviously, and we hope it will be successful. Are there any questions for a final Q&A before we wrap up? One question in Bordeaux, yes?
Thank you for the presentation. It was very nice, and you presented it. Thank you for the presentation, and it was very nice, and we got to know a lot about how to represent data and how to analyze data. Now, I have a very ambiguous situation. For example, we have a problem, any problem, for example, for instance, and we collect data, and you explain different steps situated with the data and how to analyze data and to reach a conclusion and analysis. What happens if we do not, or we cannot collect data? We do not have a data. I'll give you an example. Let's say the deepest part of the ocean, the Mariana Trench in the Pacific. I want to collect this is an example. I want to collect the data about organisms which are available there. And let's say, for instance, we do not have the data, adequate data to analyze the situation. So we have a problem, but we do not have the data, or we do not have the technology to collect the data, but we need an analysis. So how is there a possibility that, and that's my question.
Yes, so I'll give you an advice for one source to go to in order to see the way that people overcome this kind of problem. It's an excellent podcast called More or Less by BBC Radio, and actually it digs into how do people make the numbers that goes into the news. And a lot of time they ask incredibly complex questions, like, for example, lately they were studying, is the fact that people drink more tea actually make their health better because they drink boiled water? And the researcher went into incredible length to see, well, people bought tea here, so we could devise that they had access to tea, so we're boiling water, and we have to adjust the death ratio by this and this. And so, regarding your example, you should explore, of course, and explore all the ways that data is maybe not accessible, but size of the data, proxies of any sort are actually valid. I'm thinking, simple example, but a lot of new methods actually prove that satellites imagery, like we mentioned earlier, could make good assessment on the biodiversity and the kind of organism in some depth of the ocean, in places that would take weeks, if not months, to reach with real scientific boats. That's a proxy. Satellite imagery. Maybe someone has studied something in the surface that will give you some information about the depth. Another proxy. Maybe someone has dig in or dived in to go and look for something else, but gathered some proof that may document what you're looking for. And to me, that's capillarity. You have to see that data is not always, as we stand in data rendering, expressed in the way that you're actually thinking about it yourself. That's why you have to go around and see what the signs of potential data actually exist. For your specific problem, I don't have. I'm not an entrepreneur. I won't brag about that. I'm from La Rochelle. That's all I do. I'm good at picking fisheries, not on studying oceans. Thank you.
No other questions? So, yeah, Amalia, I think gave a comment. From my experience, when there is a challenge but data is not available, it means that it is probably a very crucial challenge and something worth to work with. Okay, so keep looking then, and exploration, I think, has still a long way. This is now the map of our journey with the open data cycle, and I'm very pleased there was a, sorry, one last question, sorry.
Yes, thank you for this presentation. So I have one simple question. I see many words on this actual side, collect, process, analyze, share, and reuse. So maybe it's innocent question due to my work, but as you may know, in France and in European Union, we have data protection regulation for protect the privacy of people, especially via the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, and in the future EA regulation, EA. So my question is, in your method of analysis and work for process, especially data from public social media, do you apprehend the question of privacy in the open data context? And if it's the case, how do you work to be compliant with the regulation?
So the short answer is yes. The little longer one is that what you're raising here is, of course, of the utmost importance, because some of the relevance and credibility of the study also relies on being able to actually be in line with GDPR. And that's where there's a whole lot of other issues that come mostly in the processing part. Having to do with anonymization or pseudonymization. Some mathematical models have proven pretty efficient about that, but there's also the question of where you store the data. So you enter here very paradoxically, this very legal bond to GDPR raises very technical questions. And the good thing is that, and I won't elaborate too much, but research is actually now looking into anonymization and pseudonymization in general, and that this is a field of relevant and actual application of those theories and of math theories to be brought to good use and to protect the citizens. So legal is the problem, mathematical is the answer.
Thank you very much. We may now wrap up with Hélène.
Just in few words, thanks for attending this session online, it's face-to-face session. As you said, Antoine, we have built this presentation as a takeaway presentation, so we're going to try to make sure that you can find the beautiful infographic here, maybe on the INOS website. Thanks again to the data activists and to all the participants, the INOS partners and OpenStreetMap as well. Thanks for explaining these concepts in a very clear way. and above all by giving a very concrete example. And I think you really make sure that everyone could understand what's data and how it is important to know about the cycle of data and the impacts of data. So thank you very much for this inspiring conference. Just a last word, because the conference is not over. We have a last session on tomorrow morning about the social role of the universities. And we will talk about open data with Amalia. And together we have a short talk and we'll have a round table about integrating all these tools and all the INOS projects produced during these 3 years with external partners from all over Europe. So thank you again, and let's join us on tomorrow for this final session. And thank you very much, and have a nice evening.